I became interested in politics when I understood two things. The first thing I realized was that the high facilitator body and board of directors, in response to evidence of sexual abuse by a high facilitator, were responding with a political agenda rather than an ethical, a legal, a moral agenda. And I began to notice the correlation between the politics of national government and the politics of the high organization. And this ties into the second aspect that leads me to be interested in politics, which is the nature of fractal psychology. Now, for those of you that have watched the computer-generated graphics of a fractal pattern, you know that you can zoom in and zoom in and zoom in endlessly on these graphically presented fractal mathematical formulas. And what you find is that over time, there are waves of essentially the same pattern with a little bit of uniqueness at every level of zoom. And this fractal pattern in mathematics and in nature shows up in psychology. In other words, if you will study a year in Washington, you will understand the fractal memes that define the politics in Washington. The politics on the Democratic side, the Republican side, the independent side, the lobbyist side, the people's side, the media side. You'll understand the political algorithm that determines what gets a yes vote and what gets a no vote in Washington. Now, in the naivete of New Age circles, there's a tremendous amount of dissociation between often very liberal New Age members of New Age communities such as High and what goes on in Washington. So there's great space, at a workshop for people to lament the abuse at the border crossing, the corruption, the fact that leadership is not accountable to its own laws, the fact that those with more money get away with crimes that low-income African Americans get arrested erroneously for, and in some cases killed. And there can be a righteous outrage at the actual corruption, abuses of power, scapegoating, disinformation and lies, sexual abuse, and lobbying and dealing with special interests, and manipulations behind closed doors, secrecy, attacking those that whistleblow as opposed to honoring them for telling the public. And in general, the public comes last. Meaning, if you look at the power structure in the US political system, the public comes last. But it has to come last in a way that it appears to come first more than it comes first with the other party. Otherwise, the democratic aspects of the positions, people that rely on elections, can't get elected. And so there's a lot of what's called spin that goes on. Now, as I say, I have very little interest in that because it's not really in my sphere of influence. I recognize that regardless of what I think and feel about Washington, I'm going to have a much bigger impact turning that energy to improve my own life and those around me. But what I didn't understand was that the politicians and lawyers and lobbyists in Washington were raised using the same parental protocols, using the same paradigms, using the same psychological memes that my parents used to raise me, that the parents of the high facilitators, that the parents of New Age gurus used to raise the individual. In other words, if my father cheats on his taxes, why would he suddenly stop cheating if he becomes a senator? The senator just cheats on a larger scale. If my mother, caught in the kitchen after telling everyone, no one eats any sweets before dinner, it's bad for your digestion, you get it? Anyone will be punished who eats a cookie, right? And then I walk in the kitchen and it's 2 p.m. and she's secretly sneaking a cookie. Well, she has her little flush of embarrassment. She's been caught in her hypocrisy, in the rules don't apply to me mode. So what does she do? She offers me a cookie on condition I don't tell the other 4 siblings. And you have Washington in a nutshell. Why would liberal New Age parents who behave like this create a different Washington than the one that we have? So the real reason to study Washington politics is that it can be studied, meaning there is just enough reporting done that you can actually identify the memes that determine the decision-making process in Washington. Now, why is that interesting? It's not. There's not much that an individual can do at that scale. But it's interesting because if you look closely, you will find the same memes operating at a smaller scale at your local church, at the Human Awareness Institute. And if you look even more closely, you can find that entire conversation in the cult internalized within the human ego. That in the inner dialogue, you can find the echo, the correlation between what's going on in here and what's going on in Washington and what's going on at your local nonprofit and what's going on at your local church. That's why it's interesting, because we're not talking about them. We're talking about us. Now, the politics of the New Age, the politics of progressives, the politics of liberals, the politics of spirituality and religion, or the Human Awareness Institute, cannot acknowledge that that's the case. Because the politics of the alternative, that's how this whole sector is generally categorized, is the alternative health movement, the alternative education movement, the alternative. You cannot position yourself, and alternatives have a lot going against them from day one, because you have to think. If you just go along and do what the majority is doing, it's always dumb, but you don't have to think. And it's adequate. It's mediocre, but you can survive. The American education system doesn't kill too many people in a given year. It doesn't give them an education, but you can survive. You don't have to think what you would improve. So it's incredibly popular to join the majority, which requires the least amount of effort and thought. And so to propose an alternative, it's like, I don't want to learn I don't want to have to think. I don't want to be responsible. I don't want to fail and look like the one that's, the odd one out. And so the alternative has to make a case that it's much better than the status quo. Your life will improve if you join Scientology. Your life will improve if you become a fundamentalist rather than the typical hypocritical Christian. Your life will improve if you go to a Waldorf school rather than, that normal, school where they don't help you with art and stuff. It takes a lot of energy to diverge from the norm. And who's going to spend that energy unless you convince them that it's better than the norm? Well, in many cases, it is better than the norm. By definition, whatever the majority is doing is mediocre compared to what a distinct minority is doing. Meaning in the bell curve of innovation, the distinct minority is either incredibly terrible or much better than the majority. So you've got to diverge from the norm if you want excellence, if you want exceptional, if you want something noticeably better. And that's the politics of the sale. It's unusual. You've never done anything like it, but this benefit, this benefit, this benefit. We at the Human Awareness Institute would never cover up sexual abuse by our leadership. Isn't it terrible that, President Trump grabs them by the pussy and do this? Like oh my goodness. And then he's allowed to be president. It's terrible. It's terrible. And he's allowed to forgive all his cronies. But, they're the real criminals. It's outrageous. And we're much better than that. Because I'm a spiritual person. I meditate. I do this. I don't use curse words. I never raise my voice. No, I don't do that either. And we're the Human Awareness Institute, and we believe in a world where everyone wins. Now, we've been believing in that for 40 years, and we've been committed to that for 40 years, and everyone is not winning. The facilitators are not winning. The team is not winning. The participants are not winning. And the whole world is not winning. And the planet is not winning. But you've got to have a selling point to get people to do stuff that they've never done before, that's risky, that's uncomfortable. And if you disclose the fallout, which is in New Age circles referred to as the shadow, the dark shadow in this case. The family behind the OxyContin opiate crisis did studies and understood that OxyContin was a tremendously addictive drug and it would do enormous amounts of damage. So they funded other studies. And in the other studies, if you do enough research, just the statistics, it's kind of like flipping a quarter. If you keep flipping a quarter, one of them's bound to be heads. And if you only publish the studies that show that it's heads, and heads are a good thing, and you don't publish all the studies that are tails, and tails are bad things, it looks like a sure thing. This quarter gets heads every time. That's the one we want. That'll make us billions. We'll just publish the head studies. We'll secretly pay off the researchers and not publish the tail studies, because the researchers are working for us because our government doesn't believe in doing the necessary research to protect the public, because the public isn't paying the biggest bribes. You know, the forced taxation is guaranteed anyway. So the real leverage in politics comes from, given that the American people will vote for whoever gets the best press, and given that the press is purchased, well then you need money to purchase the press. And who's going to give you a bribe for a lot of money to do an expensive, correct, hard thing? We'd like to actually develop a great drug. We'd like to spend more money than any of the other drug companies to make it safer than any of the other drugs. And we'd like to offer it at the lowest possible price so that as many people can benefit from the drug as possible. And as a result, we're barely making ends meet. And we really want this drug to be approved. But we don't have any money to pay you a bribe to be the one with the biggest war chest to buy the press. Meanwhile, there's this other company that has skimped every step of the way with very little regard for safety and is going to charge the most amount of money for that drug relative to production cost. They estimate that they're going to make $3 billion a year on this drug. And they figure out that if they pay a $500 million bribe through political PACs, that they can buy the certification to be the preferred drug. Whereas the one doing the hard work and the decent job, that took a lot of time and money and risk. And not a lot of people wanted to invest in it because they weren't out to make a killing. They were out to help the country. In a reptilian framework, it's very clear where that has to end up. So, if we understand that what's going on in our own ego, what's going on in the high community, and what's going on in the facilitator body is in some way a fractal representation of what's going on in Washington, what should we expect? Well, we should expect that the people, the participant, has to be sacrificed to protect the power structure of the facilitator body. We should expect that the oversight committee that is chosen by the facilitators, the board of directors, will be chosen for being good cronies and reliably to back up whatever goes on with the facilitators and to put the facilitators first. I mean, did Trump appoint people based on who was going to call him out for criminal activity? Or no, of course not. He's going to appoint people he can rely on. And then there'll be a nice quid pro quo. We'll give you pardons. Anyone who gets caught doing my dirty business, they'll get pardoned. Now, Tara Reade made credible sexual abuse and harassment charges against Joe Biden, which was played down by most of the mainstream press. It got good play on Fox because it's political, right? So Fox is very interested in Tara Reade because it makes, not because Fox cares about sexual abuse survivors, but Fox cares about ratings. And Fox viewers want to hear dirt on the enemy because it's a sociopathic paradigm in which we're enemies. one half of the self against the other half of the self, one half of the country against the other half of the country, one dogma against another dogma. So we should expect that both political candidates have been engaged in infidelity, sexual abuse, and abuse of power, because Tara Reade had a 20-year down slump, gained weight, received hate mail for talking about being sexually abused by Joe Biden. And she was punished by the Biden staff organization. And not only was she punished directly in terms of her career, but when she went to nonprofit aid groups that Democrats usually fund, because the Democrats all about protection for women, right? You know, Joe Biden signs the bill for increasing female protection from sexual abuse and standing up for women's rights, because that's his platform. He signs the bill, but he doesn't stop molesting his staffers, and he doesn't stop covering it up. In other words, he doesn't walk the talk. And he doesn't want to take responsibility for the gap between his talk and his walk. And so Tara Reade is put into a corner office, is harassed, is demoted, and is blacklisted within the Biden administration because she told the truth about being sexually assaulted by her boss. And Stormy Daniels has a big legal bill for telling the truth. But the president is immune from prosecution. That's the pattern. That's the politics. So it should be no surprise that my father cheats on my mother, that my mother retaliates, that my father punishes my mother for retaliating, that the children are the only ones who are innocent. It should be no surprise that when Peter Sandhill lies to his wife and escalates a romantic relationship with a participant, that the focus is on protecting the power structure, not on helping the participant. Now, the participant is supposedly the reason for the whole shebang. The reason for a government in a democracy is to help the people. We're here as your public servants. Well, how often do you feel like your government is doing everything in their power to provide value for every tax dollar as efficiently and ethically as possible at the lowest possible prices? Because you're their boss. You were the reason they went into office. You're the reason they became a public servant, was to serve you and to do a better job than the corporations, who were those bad entities that, we've got to do this because we're focused on the people. Well, when the entire board of directors and facilitator body receives a 10-hour recording of Peter Sandhill breaking his high agreements, lying to his wife, breaking every therapeutic guideline in the book, and sexually abusing a client under the influence of psychedelics, what happens? Are the community is the community's need to be at choice honored? Of course not. The first thing my other therapist, Ann Watts, wanted to push across was the need for secrecy. You could say it was a bribe. I'll hang in there as you get worse, because secrets carry shame, and they alienate the ones carrying the secret. I mean, if you want to see real loneliness, be a high facilitator, terrified of losing your job as you keep a secret, or be the sexual abuse survivor who's thrown under the bus for your own good, so that your power structure doesn't have to take responsibility for their corruption, their incompetence, their ignorance, their fear, their brutality. But the Human Awareness Institute was not created to screw over as many people in the public as possible. The participant is supposedly the entire basis for the organization to exist. We exist to serve you, except when we traumatize, shame you, bury you, or kill you, so that you don't threaten the power structure. Now, you just have to go a little bit beneath the surface to understand how common murder and assassination is, whether it's, with the CIA, the FBI, character assassinations in the press. There's nothing particularly noble about democracy. The war is played out in the press. But if you go into the presidencies, whether it's Nixon or Clinton or Bush or Trump, you'll find devastated lives, financially ruined people who didn't do anything wrong. They intersected with the agenda of someone who had more money and more rank in the cult system, who was in the wrong, but who had better attorneys, was willing to lie to maintain the status quo. So, are you willing to own that all of this is going on as an internal dialogue inside you? Or were your parents the perfect ones who didn't do anything wrong? Are you the one who doesn't have a shadow, who doesn't have any secrets about what was done to you or what you've done to others? You see, that's why, scientifically speaking, this political conversation for the most votes inside, because right now you have voices, you have constituents inside of you advocating for your vote. So who are the constituents inside each of us around this situation, and why? Well, there's one constituency inside of us that's advocating for the least amount of energy expenditure. Now that's very clear where they will cast their vote. Because the question is, are you going to do anything? And if you're going to do something, are you going to act to bury and deny and suppress and control and avoid and defend? Is that the action? Or are you going to act to increase the integrity of the protocol? You know, whether it's the protocol at High or your own protocols around relationships. Because if you have corrupt, ignorant, shame-based, fear-based leaders as your teacher, as your parents, as your government, it's asymmetrical. It's statistically improbable that somehow the student learns more than the teacher. Usually there's a trickle-down effect, but there's a trickle-up effect as well. You know, whether it's Trump or Biden or any lobbyist in Washington, they're just us with a lot more impact. So whereas our corruption might cheat the IRS out of $3,000, no big deal, right? Well, their corruption cheats the IRS out of $3 billion. It's just a bigger scale because of the role. Now that's a big problem. But millions of Americans each cheating $3,000, that's not a problem. Those are innocent people. But $3 billion, that's real crime. And so let's continue to be hypocrites and project our shadow out there and villainize the politicians, the lawyers, and the lobbyists, or in my case, the high facilitators and board members, because they're the real bad people. And I would never do that. The trouble is, within a pyramidal power structure, as long as we have that paradigm, there has to be someone at the top. And if the cult produces sociopathic, chauvinistic, emotionally illiterate, traumatically illiterate, corrupt, fear-based, shame-based people, then one of those people has to take the top position. And they will do what everyone else does at a much larger scale and be hated for it. And believe me, the politicians, the leaders, hate the people, the participants, the children, because they grasp the truth, which is that if their neighbors or their children or their uncle had the same opportunity, that statistically speaking, almost all of them would be just as corrupt as they are. And so they get the payoff of bigger bribes, you know, and Biden has his estate of enriched family members bought off by the Chinese, bought off by the Pakistanis, bought off by this and that and the other, and Trump has his various inputs from the Russians, and everyone's family in Washington can be bettered and skirt around the rules. A lot of them are attorneys, so they know just how to get around the edge. So the problem is, if you want to be a leader in this cult, because we're not a responsible cult, we don't own our ability and willingness to respond, we want the parent to fix it. So the problem, if you want to be a leader, is you're going to be blamed for everything that goes wrong, and you'll be given very little credit for what goes right. But the payoff is you'll get to do what everyone else is doing, bribing, stealing, lying, molesting, better and on a bigger scale than anyone else. But you'll be hated more than anyone else. A little bit of the trade-off. Whereas the innocent, weak one would never steal $3 billion from the US government or this, that, or the other, would never pay a dark web assassin $400,000 to destroy the computer and put child pornography and just have their opponent nicely put away. Never do that. We just change the mileage when reporting the miles on our tax return. We're a nice little person that's being abused by those horrible people. I don't want to be a leader. I don't want the heat. I don't want the shame. I don't want the antagonism. I want someone else who was raised in the exact same cult that I was raised in, which means they're no more psychologically literate than I am. They're just as terrified of being found out as I am. But they're willing to take that for what? The bribe, for the power, for whatever. So what's the politics going on in this situation? Well, we each have a voice that's lobbying for conserving energy. So that voice in me says, don't make this video. Achieve a goal that's going to bring pleasure, that's going to bring value. Don't worry about the next sexual abuse survivor at High. They can take care of themselves. High has been abusing people for decades. What's it to you? Get on, buy another, go out and work and buy another TV, etc. Or just rest. Just give it a rest and feel better. Expend less energy. For the viewer, the team member, the board, the facilitators as well. Don't respond to this video. It's so complicated. You have plenty of other things to deal with. Whatever is the path of least resistance, I vote for energy conservation. Now, how much is that vote in you? Is it 10% of the vote is just whatever is solving energy? Is it 20%? Is it 80%? That faction has a vote inside each person, inside High, inside Washington, etc., and it's why things get swept under the carpet. Everyone knows it's absurd, but it will take energy to fix the absurdity. Everyone knows the house is dirty. It'll take energy to clean the house. I don't want to clean the house. So let's change the subject. Then there's the shame agenda. What's going to make me look bad? Because anyone who's ever been shamed, i.e. everyone in a shame-based culture, does not want to be shamed again. So this faction within each of us has to look at who's going to be left carrying the bag. Now the bag, as the shame gets passed around the circle, is who's going to be made the scapegoat. I don't want to do that. I don't want to be anywhere near that bag. So that has, 30% of the vote? Maybe 20%, just whatever is going to save energy, not touching it. 30%. I don't want to be anywhere near the shame bag. Now, obviously, in the polarization of a cult, you have good and bad. Well, the power structure tries to foist this off onto someone with lower rank and often gets away with that. But if they don't get away with it, then it's the top of the power structure that has the shame. So the High board of directors, the facilitators, are the team enablers for knowing that the facilitator sexually abused participants and doing nothing about it? not telling the police, not demanding safety protocols, is the team enablers. How much effort do they have to do to pretend they don't know about it? Has any team member ever asked or put out a survey, how many people in my group have been sexually abused by anyone around High? Has High ever sent out that questionnaire? Well, we don't want to know, because we don't want to be anywhere near the situation of what we might have done. You know, in the Jeffrey Epstein case, women, attractive, well-positioned women, including Ghislaine Maxwell, were the prime enablers of Jeffrey Epstein. Meaning, if Jeffrey Epstein just went around knocking on lower-income doors in Florida and said, hey, will you come and give me a hand job at my house for $200? They'd have told him to get lost. But you've got to sell it just right. How would you like a little Christmas money? And isn't it nice when one of your high school friends says, hey, you'd like an extra $200 of Christmas money? And of course, she doesn't tell you that Jeffrey, after molesting her, has paid her $200 if she brings a new victim in. Because it's not in the political interest of a cult obsessed with money, in which money is more valuable than the people who make it, let alone the innocence of the people who make it. You see, she's already been wounded. She's not going to feel the pain of the next victim. She's not going to feel the terror of the next victim, going into a billionaire's room and just being raped or told to undress and promised all these things. And you've got a few seconds to decide, has anyone prepared me to know what to do for my soul, for my dignity in this moment? I don't know. I guess I'll just do what the rich, older, smart person that has all these connections thinks is a good idea. I don't know. Well, hundreds of molested underage girls can just go by once you get the routine built in nicely. You've just got to incentivize it so that everyone dissociates from the other person. The more you dissociate, the more you're operating from the reptilian brain. The reptilian brain has no empathy. It's fight, freeze, flee, or fawn. And it's done out of fear. Fear of the reptilian behavior that you've already experienced in your cult. And the lower, many of Jeffrey Epstein's victims were orphans or very former sexual abuse survivors. And what predators understand is that the more you have been damaged before, the more receptive you are to future abuse. And, serial killers will say they know their victim from 30 feet away, because the posture tells them, I'm not going to fight you. I will allow the abuse. So we understand the politics of Jeffrey Epstein, high school girls recruiting high school girls, recruiting high school girls. We understand the politics of Ghislaine Maxwell, bailed out after her father stole hundreds of millions of pounds of people's savings and retirements in England, to ally herself with a new powerful figure who will protect her as long as she procures underage girls for him to pass on his hostility, his rage. And You can understand the politics, since his house is labeled, is loaded with cameras. You can understand the politics. You see, because of my 10-hour video program, recording of Peter Sandhill sexually abusing me and taking $175 an hour for it, and because of the email records with the facilitator bodies and board members, every single one of them have participated in multiple crimes, legally, multiple ethical violations, and have lost in the court of public opinion. Because nobody wants to pay money to go to a school of leaders who are unlicensed and will cover up their own sexual abuse at the client's expense and ask for a tax-free deduction so that they don't have to pay for roads or anything else, so that they can abuse their clients and not even have to pay taxes on the abuse. Nobody's going to go along with that narrative. So there's a vote going on inside High, and one side of the vote says, this is outrageous, we've got to clean up our act. We've got to protect our public from the shadow sides of ourselves. We've got to tell people what's going on. We've got to enable their power to be at choice. Well, how many times has the CIA come forward and say, we shot the wrong guy while we were seducing his wife to enable her to set him up to be arrested for drugs that we planted? And we got the wrong guy, and we spent $2.5 million, and higher-ups don't want anyone to know. How many times do you hear that story? In a cult that thinks it's important to have things going on behind back doors, and is okay with billions and billions of dollars of their money going into sociopathic, unethical, and illegal activity that is an organization for that purpose. Well, High doesn't have a CIA. They just have a protocol of backing each other up with shared guilt and shared secrets. Because there is not a facilitator on the team who has not fucked up in major ways at one time or another and has not cleaned up their act. So if you're there witnessing, so everyone's got dirt on each other. And this is the one area that the Democrats and Republicans all are in bed together in Washington. They may fight about abortion. They may do grandstanding. But the one thing they all agree to keep quiet on is how our families and our personal finances are skyrocketing, both legally and illegally. We'll all not talk about it. We'll all pass the laws that allow us to do it. And in there, we're in bed to the hilt. We have a bipartisan government in Washington. It's just the only thing that they cooperate with 100% is to improve their own bank accounts, to reduce their own immunity, and benefit their family at the expense of the public they said they were there to serve. So we have the vote that just is the lazy or energy management vote. We have the vote of shame. I don't want to do anything. In the facilitator body, we have the vote for, do we clean up our act and tell people what's going on, or do we put energy to silence and suppress the information? That's a pretty big vote. That determines the entire future of your organization. Because if within the majority of the facilitator body, or within the majority of each person in the facilitator body. Because there's nothing stopping an ethical facilitator saying, I don't care what any of you say. I am going to tell the community exactly what's going on. I'm going to tell law enforcement what's going on. I will take all the consequences that emerge from that. But I'm putting the public safety first, and I'm going to do it this way, this way, this way, and this way, and I'm going to follow the guidance of a competent, licensed trauma and sexual abuse specialist, and I'm going to put my priority into helping Dane Rose and the other sexual abuse survivors that I'm aware of get back on their feet. And if I go down trying, that's my mission, because I'm committed to a world where everyone wins. And when you've got corruption and ignorance and shame at the top of the power structure, no one wins except the reptilian brain. The sociopathic program wins at the expense of everyone else. Because when the reptilian brain is induced through trauma and then elected to leadership, it still continues operating with fear. Fear of exposure, fear of its shadow coming out, fear of loss, fear of not looking good. And that determines, I'm going to do this, this, and this to avoid my fear. And a sexual abuse victim has gotten in the way. They're amplifying my fear. I'm going to shut them up. How am I going to push that down? Trauma and reptilian behavior produces and stimulates the reptilian brain in every person who experiences it. And in a psychologically illiterate culture such as our own, that does not get medicine. And the more criminal activity, be it literal crimes or the crime against the empathic brain, in the violation and betrayal of trust, the more guilt and pain there is. The more guilt and pain there is that you don't have the courage and competency to heal, the more you want to descend into your reptilian brain, because the reptilian brain has no feeling. It has no capacity to love. So the reptilian brain doesn't feel a lot of hurt, a lot of grief. It can't process grief. So if you are unable to process grief, you'll want to retreat into your reptilian brain. And these things are going on, these patterns are going on in all of our lives. Of course, the horror in our cult is to be made the scapegoat. That's the one you play musical chairs, music goes along, the bag goes around. The music stops, and the deal with musical chairs is whoever doesn't have a chair, they're out. They're out of the game. They don't get to play anymore. Well, why does someone keep removing the chair? Why is this even an interesting game? We're going to set up a game that guarantees that 99% of everyone who plays it will lose the game. Because you may start with 100 people, but at the end of musical chairs, there's just one person who has a chair. Now, why doesn't everyone have a chair? Why isn't that the game? Well, you see, the fear of loss, the competition to not be there holding the bag is so deeply visceral that it engages people because it's what's going on inside. We're just externalizing the shame game. And it speaks to me for some strange reason, which I can't articulate because I'm psychologically illiterate in a cult that will send me cradle to grave without a single hour of psychological training in any competent way. So we have the faction that doesn't like to not know. You know, part of chauvinism is the arrogant son of a bitch who knows it all gets rank in the cult. And the person who says, I have no idea. The teacher calls on the student and says, who built the bridge spanning the Mississippi from here to here in 1901? These are critical facts that students should be wasting their time with, but of course we can't challenge the inanity of our teachers. Who built the bridge? I don't know. I was thinking about whether or not Dad's going to hit my mother over the head with a broken beer bottle. I thought that was more important than who built a bridge I've never even seen in my life. Well, the teacher, of course, knows that your well-being is dependent on being able to focus on dead bridge builders and ignore your childhood trauma, which the teacher will never ask you once about. Meaning, despite the incredibly high rates of trauma and sexual abuse throughout our cult for generations, no teacher has the decency to say, could I have a show of hands to see how many of you have had your father or your older brother's penis jammed in to your anus or vagina? Could I have a show of hands to that? Okay. Good. 20% of you. How many of you have been hit in the last month by someone twice your size, inducing feelings of helpless? Okay. Another 20%. How many of you are frightened of going home today and wondering whether or not you're going to meet drunk mom or sober mom or hangover mom? And you're terrified of meeting hangover mom, and you don't know. And completely different rules apply. How many of you are frightened of that at 8 years old? You see, these would actually be intelligent questions. But when Joey doesn't know the name of a dead bridge builder, he's humiliated in front of the class for not knowing, for the intelligence of trying to come up with a problem and a solution to the problem that a child can't solve. What do I do if one part of the family I depend on is hurting the other part of the family, and I'm too small to protect them? And I'm surrounded by sociopaths who will tease me, humiliate me, and never ask, let alone teach me what to do. So he's humiliated for not knowing. Well, the incredible ignorance that it takes to humiliate people for not knowing, particularly without taking the time to investigate whether or not the reason they're not doing their homework is they've got an older brother trying to set fire to their bicycle and throwing rocks at them, and strangely enough, an 8-year-old is smart enough to know what's more important. An English essay that no one's ever going to read except an over-harassed teacher who doesn't want to read it, about a subject that is irrelevant. Or how do I stop being caught on fire? An 8-year-old is actually smart enough to put their well-being, their actual real-life problems ahead of the ignorance and stupidity of a teacher who has lived in this cult, who knows that these things are going on in the class, and doesn't want to know what's going on with who, because the parents of the abused children will call up the principal and say, wait a minute, you're educating my child on how to confront me, hitting, beating. You don't think I, an emotionally illiterate drunk, can raise my child the way my sociopathic asshole raised me? You don't think so? You don't think I can do it? I'm going to sue you. I'm going to make your life a living hell. You better watch your grandchildren, or I'll be after you. Okay, let's let the 6-year-old deal with the sociopaths in the family system. We're too scared. We're only the grown children who call ourselves your teachers. So, how many hours of training have you got on how to respond competently, compassionately, ethically, intelligently to this video? What do you think is the way you should be responding? Should you be backing up the abusers? Should you be running away? Should you be reading some books that would teach you how to respond? Or should you be piling on to the victim and complaining that they're ruining your life by bringing these difficult ideas to light? How do you think you should be responding? And if you don't know, in a shame-based cult that punishes people for ignorance and stupidity, you see, you're bound to be ignorant and stupid in an ignorant and stupid cult that is systematically inducing ignorance and stupidity. When you raise a hand in school and ask a problem that would require psychological literacy or trauma literacy or knowledge about incest, more than half the teachers in this country, even with the easiest softball handed to them, have no idea what to do. And they've been shamed as little kids for not knowing, and they've got the power now. So they can just lay in and send that kid to the back of the class and give them detention for having the audacity to put them on the spot with something they have no idea what they're doing. Because it shakes the power structure to acknowledge that the teacher does not know what they should be teaching, is profoundly and systematically sociopathic in what they choose to teach and not choose what they will and will not talk about, what they punish and what they reward, and blames the victim. Well, teachers, more than most people, need to know it all. And so when they don't, because their cult has not taught them a thing, they flash red. They flash shame. And if every time they revealed the incompetence of their parents and teachers, they were punished and sent to the room and hit, then that's exactly what an emotionally illiterate teacher will do to the student that's actually pointing out how they can do their job. So the politics of I don't know and I don't want to be caught not knowing, which is a politics of shame, that faction also clearly runs for the hills. Could you put it in a letter? Let's talk about that next week. I'm really important. I'm really busy. I've got 8 hours of television to watch today. Could we put anything intelligent and important that would require any empathy at all? Could we just, wouldn't you just do me the favor of pretending that I'm interested and that I'm not actively avoiding this topic every single time you bring it up for the last 10 years? And why are you so dumb that you don't get that I don't want to deal with this? So that we've got 4 votes within every human being who wants to say, avoid this topic. Now then we have the loyalty to the abuser vote. Now this is one of the most dangerous votes because it's one of the areas that if someone is all evil, they don't get any loyalty. But the trouble is that most of us, if not all of us, have some good side and some bad side. Now, what do we mean by good and bad? Some area that we are corrupt and cause unnecessary suffering and betray our values and break the law and whatever. We have that. And then we have this other part that is generous and kind and helpful and this and that and the other. Well, the shame-based part of the abuser uses their better side to get payback. I was really nice to you there. I didn't tell when you molested a high facilitator. I didn't tell when you had no idea what you were doing in this situation and then they died. I didn't tell about that. And now you're going to report me? You're going to ruin my whole life? When have I been mean to you? So you have the voice of it's clan loyalty. It's quid pro quo loyalty. And it's not about ethics. It's not about what's good for the patient. It's not about what's good for the country. It's what's good for me. I did that for you. Now you have to cover this up for me. Well, that's a voice. Well, every single person associated with the Human Awareness Institute has received some benefit from the Human Awareness Institute organization and facilitator body. And if you were chosen for their board, within the crony politics, you don't pick anyone on your board. I mean, industrialists have been doing this for hundreds of years, and so they have laws, and the SEC will investigate if you're just putting what's called a paper board in place, where they'll rubber stamp whatever you want because you're paying them a bribe yearly to just do whatever the one person who appointed you wants. But your job as the owner of a corporation or a public nonprofit is actually to help the public. But when that's inconvenient, I want you to just overlook this. Well, you've got emotional bribes. You see, when Ann Watts, who was my relationship therapist for more than 5 different relationships within the high community, meaning I met the woman within high. There were problems because high doesn't teach you in the workshops how to deal with just about anything. You can't ask for your 100% about trauma if you don't know what trauma is. You can't say my 100% is to know whether you have PTSD or not if you don't know what PTSD is. You can't say my request is that we engage like this and not like this that helps me with attachment disorder if I don't know what attachment disorder is. So the fact that you get into a romantic relationship at high pretty much guarantees you're going to have problems, statistically speaking. Now, is it 60% of the people who have problems? Is it 80%? Is it 98%? The vast majority of people who enter a romantic relationship in the United States, be it at high or anywhere else, are going to experience unnecessary pain, fear, trauma, betrayal, shock, flipped words that mean the exact opposite thing, saying yes when they're going to experience problems because we're a psychologically illiterate cult. And the high facilitators make money saying, we'll fix them. Come see us. We'll help you. Well, Anne helped me in some ways, hurt me in some ways, and had no idea and didn't do anything in other areas. But obviously I'm invested. Everyone wants their therapist who knows all about them to like them. It's the most predictable thing imaginable. Well, when your therapist has their 100% agenda on your well-being, and you want them to like you, and they say, well, do this and it will be good for you, and you do it because you want them to like you, and your life improves, That's a good use of that need to be liked that is in every regressed child, which is the state of every traumatized person who hasn't dealt with their infantile trauma. But when she has another agenda that's not your top well-being, instead it's, I don't want to look bad. I don't want to be in a fight with the corruption in my fellow facilitators. So if you'll just do this for me, if you'll take on my shame, my organization's shame, my students' shame, my co-facilitator's shame, if you will take all that shame on and not tell anyone about it, so they can't help you, of course, because you're invisible. There is no into me you see. There's into me you don't see, because I'm trying to protect my therapist from her own incompetency. And if you could just hide that from me as well, if you'll go along with the lie that says, these secrets are really for you. You know, I would do anything for you. I love you. You're my therapeutic client. I have nothing but goodwill for you. And because I care about you, it's really important that you not report the sexual abuse of the student that I trained and want to keep recommending to the public. Because if they know that we sexually abused participants at High, they're not going to hire us to do therapy. If you could just do that one little thing of make the biggest trauma of your life invisible and become a dirty secret, I will be so pleased with you. You know, don't tell your mother. It'll be our little secret. It'll break your mother's heart. What's going to break Mom's heart? You jabbing your fucking fat penis in a 5-year-old, or her telling the truth? You know, Peter Sandhill was furious, he still is, that I'm telling exactly what he did. He's not furious that he did it. He hasn't offered a refund for doing it. High is not furious that he did it. They're furious that someone's telling the public what a public nonprofit is doing with their public tax deduction. Peter does not say, Dane, this was a disaster. How can I make it right? No one at High says, how can we make it right? The question is, how can we bury this so that as few people know about it as possible? And so we'll have meetings to discuss how to bury it. We'll sue Dane to bury it. We'll change the subject. We'll ignore emails. We'll do all kinds of things to bury it. Because all these parts are all voting, no, let's not tell the public what happened. Now, if you're High facilitators, if the room of love cannot vote to give people the choice to make an informed decision about who to work with for their healing and therapy, why on earth would you expect some sociopath in Washington to be more loving than Ann Watts, or Peter Sandhill, or Felicia? Why would you expect your state governor to respond to a politically awkward email when Peter Rangel made it very clear to me from day one he would not respond to any email from me? The person he trained, the person he recommends, his colleague, his organization, his commitment. Peter Rangel has told me over and over again, I commit as a facilitator at the Human Awareness Institute to creating a world where everyone wins. And I always thought that included the people sexually abused by High facilitators. But that's not Peter Rengel's definition of what he means by that commitment. His commitment to a world where everyone wins is a commitment to not respond to the person asking him for help when his colleague sexually abuses them for money referred by High. But you can see where the votes are lining up. We haven't got a single vote so far inside any of us for confronting this issue. You see, because in many of us, there's a moral outrage vote. I am outraged. Let's get him. Trump, get him. Great. It's just, how can you be morally outraged when your teachers, your therapists, your community is shaming and sexually abusing a High participant and doing nothing about it? It's kind of kill Ann Watts, throw her out of her house. What is the outrage? So the outrage voice, when it's your own side, just kind of hides up and says nothing. The one where, I'm grateful. I had this High experience. I've had my first this experience with High. I'm grateful for that. I don't want to. I'll give them a few clients to abuse. They did something for me, and maybe they're still doing something for me. And then we have the sex addict. Now, the sex addict is a demographic within each one of us, and then it's a very strong representation in, maybe 20% of the High workshop attendees, our regular attendees, who go to fuck. They'll go through the exercise and the workshop and this and that and the other, and they want to meet someone, and they're not having enough sex. And that's their goal, to get their rocks off with a new relationship that weekend. Well, I'm not going to High to love, to learn what love is, to tell the truth, to protect innocent sexual abuse survivors. I have an agenda, and the more narrow that agenda is, the more addictive that agenda is. I'm not interested in that. So the sexual addict, of course, has no interest in any of this, because the sexual addict participates in abuse. You notice that High will not define the distinction between love and addiction, or point out the destructive side of sexuality. They will not draw that line of how highly promiscuous, unsafe, this, that, the other, etc., is actually incredibly dangerous. They don't define sexual addiction. Well, why? Well, they'd lose some of their marketplace if before the sex addict can act, everyone understands all the tells of whether this is love or addiction. And it doesn't feel as good. It feels much better when you can take another drink as being hearty and a man, as opposed to an alcoholic. So the sex addict, that 20%, not interested in. The 20% of me that is a sex addict, I don't want to be making a video here. I want to be watching porn. What's this got to do with managing pain? It's painful. You're making me feel uncomfortable. So you got the uncomfortable. It's painful, it's uncomfortable. This is weird. It's not normal. So you got that vote against it. Then you got the law of mass. And this says that whenever you have one person in conflict with a group of people, the group always wins. How many times have you seen 20 people all gang up to try and beat up one poor schmuck? and the schmuck kicks all the 20 people down. I mean, that's the Jackie Chan movie because it's happened so many times, right? We've all been knocked down by the bully. The bully is always the big one. The older brother, the parent, the school system. You're a bad child. How dare you? You know, when my third grade teacher died in a car accident, I went numb because there was not a single adult around me who knew how to grieve. And there were tons of emotionally psychotic grown-ups who knew how to suppress and shame their feelings. I had never grieved anything in my life. And as someone with attachment disorder and an inability to bond with both parents, she was the teacher who was 3 times more meaningful to me than my mother. And there's no place to grieve. There's no place for intensity. That was the rule in my family. No one feels an intense feeling. I went numb in a second. And I remembered the painkiller. You know, it's like Novocaine in the dentist. It's like, I have no feelings. I can do anything. I have dissociated from my entire empathic brain. And I've never felt so good. I feel nothing. Not terror, not grief, not pain, not shame, nothing. Well, someone traumatized like that in a psychologically illiterate cult does not come out of that well. It's not like you go to sleep and suddenly you know how to deal with grief. You don't go through Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's thing. And it's not like in an emotionally illiterate cult, your New Age parent who believes in unconditional love and light teaches you that you have to get angry. You have to go through these stages of grief. No. Now, the trouble with dissociating to that degree is the body is trying to pull you back in the body. I didn't want to feel it. So I became hyperactive, was the term used. The emotional load was too hard to come into my body. I couldn't deal with it because my parents couldn't deal with it. They'd already told me, we're children. I mean, they don't have the decency to spell this out, but they had told me in 1,000 different gestures and facial expressions, we are children. We are terrified of our own feelings. Please don't feel anything or we'll hit you. Well, actions speak louder than words. My parents had made this very clear. If they can't deal with feelings, if they're so terrified of these feelings and they're the big ones, they must be dangerous. Plus, I don't want to upset them. I've got to avoid these feelings. So I would go through this. I developed a manic ability because if I would fidget and move around and be restless, I wouldn't feel anything. I could avoid the pink elephant in the room that all the grown-ups were desperate for me to avoid. I was doing this for them. Now, the replacement teacher noticed that I was the most fidgety, dissociative person in the class. So he started shouting at me. That didn't help because I had no way to come back in my body. A shouting idiot is no comfort. He can't deal with this. Why should I be able to? I'm 8 years old. So the teacher issues an ultimatum. This is Waldorf school for you, by the way. The teacher issues an ultimatum. Dane goes or I go. How's that? Your teacher is so incompetent, so trauma illiterate, your parents are so incompetent, so trauma literate, that the student has to be expelled for demonstrating the very symptoms any psychologically literate person would expect. Yeah, that's it. Now, having been expelled, parents Waldorf parents, in a sociopathic and psychologically illiterate framework, are too dumb to figure out this guy needs trauma support, and his parents are the last people in the world to give him to them. They're new age, dissociative hippies who are terrified of their feelings. How are they going to help a child grieve? And when they've already traumatized him into dissociation and attachment disorder, it's going to be really hard to earn this kid's trust so that he'll show up and come back in his body because he's met a single competent adult. Well, this acknowledges that the entire power system of the parents and the school system and the cult at large and the Waldorf education system is nuts. Now, if anyone in the power structure admits the obvious, then nobody knows what to do because they're not adults. They don't have a framework. They're children in a grown body doing what they're told. And Rudolf Steiner didn't point out how to deal with trauma. Rudolf Steiner didn't talk about what to do when most of his followers are hypocrites, can't walk their talk. Oh, they can paint nice murals on the wall, and they can make sure there's a yellow classroom for 5 years old and a red classroom for 6 years old. And they can do the form because who can't grab a paintbrush and paint some paint on the wall? But actually know what you're doing emotionally in the deepest terror of your own psyche? Reading a lecture from a dead German guy isn't going to help you about that. So, no, they didn't know what they were doing. And they punished and shamed the child. Well, this shamed my father. So he had donated money and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and then his son wasn't good enough and was going to do. So now a father who already is filled with shame and can't deal with his feelings has a shitload more shame. It doesn't mean he talks about it. It means he becomes more compulsive. So now the deterioration of the family system comes down on the head of the child. And the school gets away with it because they just throw out the people they traumatize and don't know how to deal with. And it's wonderful. Then we can go back to being the wonderful Waldorf school of this, that, and the other. See, it's throw one kid out, and then the parents of all those kids who didn't know how to deal with trauma or grief or want to confront my parents either, they all told their kids to avoid me because that's what we do in a shame-based scapegoating cult. When all the ignorance and cruelty of the entire system in the cult ends up hitting one kid hard, they show the symptoms for the rest of the group, particularly if they're sensitive. So they show the symptoms. And what reptiles do is they say, we don't want those symptoms in our kids. So the person who needs the most love, care, and support in the entire community is going to be the person that we isolate. Out of fear, out of ignorance, out of incompetence, in a protocol that shames, isolates, and betrays the one in the most pain. So it happens in Waldorf school. It happens in government. It happens at work. It happens in relationship. The one who doesn't fit in the group, right? Everyone doesn't invite them to the party. There's not a figuring out what's going on and this, that, and the other. Let's just get rid of them. And it happens at high. Because there are very few people thrown out of the high organization. I happen to be one of them. Now, this just tells me there are very few people who insist on telling the public when a high facilitator sexually abuses them. Because that's why I got kicked out of the email list. That's why Ann Watts made up an excuse about how she couldn't get me into a workshop because I would ruin the small group structure. I've joined the workshop where Ann referred me to Peter, who then sexually abused me a few weeks later. I got into that workshop 3 days notice, a level 4. But with all the help of Ann Watts, doing her best to what? Help her client. After I bought a plane ticket to fly to a workshop to get support, she said, you know, the small groups, they're just perfect. And if you come, we can't, like every other workshop, adjust it to where there's 6 people in a small group or 5 or 4, and we'll negotiate and find the win-win. No. This one workshop where you need help, where you're asking for my support, we couldn't possibly make an adjustment to the perfect small group size because you've been sexually abused by my colleague, and if you let that slip in the workshop, it'd be devastating. Now, we're not going to do our job and tell the workshop what went on and encourage them to support you, because that's what leaders do, and we're scared little children. We don't want anyone to find out. So instead, we'll go off to teach love, and we'll leave you behind in a traumatic state, telling you it's because we love you, because that's what parents in abuse cults do. And your job is to be a nice boy and shut the fuck up about it. It's I could see my mother doing the exact same thing. I'm sure one of your parents, statistically speaking, would be kind enough to do the same for you. The high facilitators do not have licenses for the most part to practice, which means they haven't gone through the rigorous training. Why would they bother for something as meaningless as the human heart or their core subject? And do they want that coming out? No. So who's left to vote with any competency, with any compassion? Who knows what love is? Well, none of these parts know what love is. Why not? Well, has High ever defined love? Or even sex? Or has it gone to elaborate lengths to make it as fuzzy as possible? Sexual, sacred energy exchange. What is love? Is it this? Is love being told that you want this and then we violate the boundaries, a level 5 or a level 7? Is unconditional love just mean that you tell someone you want this and then they'll do the opposite? Is that love? By the time you come out of this, you're so fucked up. You don't know what any of it means, but you get the vague sense that somehow doing the opposite of what you want to do is transcendent. Because it was in level 5, and it's the advanced workshop where we fuck you up. In the small workshops, we teach you to be at choice, not at choice to who's sexually abusing who, because we're going to hide that from you, but at choice to anything that we're willing to tell you. Because how are you at choice with a piece of medicine if you don't know the side effects, because the company that produces the side effects hides the side effects so that they'll sell more capsules? You're not at choice. So we've exhausted many of the dominant cult personas that would vote to do anything. So what's left? We've got fear and shame, because they're driving a lot of this. Plus, there's obviously some part of the facilitator, of me, of you. There's presumably some part that actually gives a damn about love and good relationships. Maybe not enough to tell the truth, maybe not enough to study 1,000 hours of psychology, but enough to hang out in a circle and smile at people. What does that part want? Well, see, the trouble is we're in a minority. You see, if everyone listened to Bernie Sanders, we'd have health care. Americans that needed it would get stuff for their rent during coronavirus. Trump would have apologized for all of the different ways he botched it and all of his sociopathic, I'm not going to wear a mask, I'm important, I'm above the law, all this stuff. So, if we had a competent set of parents in Washington, then Dad would admit that he fucked up and learn how to do a better job like I want to be number one, I want to be the leader. I just don't want to have to do the work that my people need. I want to fuck around without a condom. I just don't want to actually learn how to raise my children. It's like, aren't I important? It's not, when you have abused children like Trump, highly abused and punished for any sign of feminine energy, weakness, tears, he hates weakness, just like Hitler. Hitler was a severely abused child. Nobody stopped Hitler's parents from abusing him. No one taught him about shame. But we all blame Hitler, right? Because Hitler did back to the world exactly what his parents did to him. You mean the world is as sociopathic and fucked up as Hitler is? Well, what do you make of the systemic childhood abuse and the protocol in America today that you can have a child in 1 year from now? Go ahead. You can be an addict. You can have incest in your history. You can have PTSD. You can have an opium addiction. Go right ahead. Don't tell us about it. Just have a kid. And since all of these diseases are contagious, once you've entirely fucked that kid up, when they feel angry, we'll tell the kid that it's his fault, and he will feel furious. And after another few hundred rounds of hypocrisy, incompetence, and shame, when they join a gang or a white supremacist group or think that killing a race, just an externalization of killing the inner part of the psyche that is enacted by butchering innocence and shaming the child, then we can all agree that Hitler is the evil one. Because then none of us have to look at the fact that we haven't written a single letter to our congressman saying, could we do some science to see what kind of study would need to be prepared so that we know how to educate parents to know how they're likely to fuck up their children before they actually do it. Because we actually care about the next generation based on the traumas, shames, and abuses of the last 100 years, and we'd actually like to do something about it, other than blaming Hitler. Because for 1,000 years before Hitler, not one country thought to educate their parents on psychological literacy and on raising a child any more than we do. So, at some point it becomes obvious that if we're this crazy, why aren't we doing something? Unfortunately, research by David Dunning points out that in order to know if you're good at something, it takes exactly the same skill and competency to be good at something. Meaning, if you're complete shit as a parent, the very fact that you are complete shit as a parent means that you don't know enough to grasp that you are shit as a parent. So you actually have to bother to read a good 100 hours. I mean, I know it's too much to protect the next generation from our own stupidity to actually bother to read 100 hours. This guy says it's taking too much time. This one doesn't have any interest either. All these inner votes are saying this has nothing to do with me. I don't want to be the fall guy. I don't want to be anywhere near this. I don't want to feel shame and recognize, because you see, the more I read and looked into this, the more I understood that I was an abuser. And it started 10 years before the main abuse, when Peter sexually abused me in the first round and told me it was love. And because I thought that was love, I had come to High to actually learn for my first relationships, because I thought that was love, I then was loving to other people in the same way. So once you've been taught by an incompetent teacher, you've learned how to infect other people with your ignorance, your shame, your stupidity. So while Peter has never done anything wrong and it's not a High issue, I don't have the luxury of reading books about competency and relationship and pretending that this has nothing to do with me. I say, I see. That would have been nice to know before I did this with this woman. I could have fucked her up this way. I was just asking for my 100%. But I was completely psychologically illiterate. So my 100% was the type of 100% that would predictably come from a completely psychologically illiterate human being. Well, I don't take it personally, because none of the women involved knew a goddamn thing either, because I met them at High. And let's not pretend that all of this dysfunction emerges at High. It's not like if I'd met them out of High, they suddenly would have known all about their feelings or how to repair trauma. Of course not. But the trouble is, a lot of what gets passed in Washington is out of blackmail, shame, guilt, and narcissistic self-interest by the politicians. A lot of what passes at home. How did I get the cookie at 6 years old? I caught my mother eating a cookie and breaking her own rule. I didn't get hit. I got a cookie. So there's a tiny sliver, maybe 20 or 30%, the goodness of human beings, the aspiration of ideals, the belief in honesty, the belief in sanity. Because every single High facilitator and board member asks every single person who understands the facts to go insane in order to support their passivity. Because the High position is insane, and because it's insane to expect leaders of love, intimacy, and sexuality who are insane to be able to teach participants how to be sane. And one of the cruelest things you can possibly do to someone is to ask them to go crazy in order to protect your shame. Because your shame is temporal. It's gone in a year. So you had your secret. You didn't want anyone to know. So you reinvented the whole language system in order to justify your secret and call it love and whatever. Okay, so you got away with that. It's a year later. The person who believed you has now got a warped definition of love for the rest of their life. And it is an incredibly cruel, incredibly ignorant, narcissistic sociopath who asks an entire community to go insane to protect positions that are insane. Because insanity is the dissociation between one's behavior and stated goals, between the facts and the words used to define the facts. That is what insanity is. When you drink boiling water and say, this is very cold, I'm going to freeze to death, you are crazy, because you've dissociated behavior from goal, words from meaning. And the positions that every facilitator and board member are occupying, and every community member who believes in love, intimacy, and sexuality is holding, who's doing nothing about this, is insane. And it trickles down. Ann Watts asked me to go insane to believe this was for my own good. Peter Sandhill asked me to go insane by believing that sexually abusing a participant for money is love. Peter Sandhill asked me to go insane by ignoring all the data to use his great psychic powers to have me marry one of the most incompatible people I've ever met, but who in Peter's psychic vision was the most luminous possibility he could see in my future. Didn't matter how many facts I brought to Peter Sandhill. He was pathologically insane. Data doesn't matter when you're crazy. Psychic powers can transcend all the facts. You know, you could just look at the evangelical priests who just knew Trump was going to win this election. And just rewind the tapes a month ago. It was going to win. It was surefire because God talked to them personally. And da, da, da. How insane do we have to get to avoid the shame of one man? Nationally? In a family? At high? Well, it's a lot. And the price is high for all concerned. So there's this small 20 or 30% voting constituent that knows exactly what's going on, that's horrified, that doesn't want to see innocent high participants be sexually abused by their facilitators, that doesn't want to see scapegoating, that knows that this isn't love, but that feels small and helpless. Why does it feel small and helpless? Well, when that voice spoke up when we were 6 years old, we got hit by the giant. We got hit. We got sent to our room. We got shamed into silence. Don't talk to your father that way. He's allowed to be a monomaniac, cool sociopathic narcissist, but don't you point it out. He's your father. How dare you insult the high facilitators? They're your teachers about love and intimacy. How dare you challenge Donald Trump? He's the man from the Lord. Well, there's a small part of each one of us that has good instincts that gets knocked down because it's a minority in the country, in the family, in ourselves. And the majority doesn't like it. My popularity in high has plummeted for advocating for the smallest voice in the psyche, the one that actually wants to base things on science, wants to base things where the word in the dictionary as it where love means this and it doesn't mean this. All these other parts inside me, inside you, inside I, they are furious. This is taking too much time. We could be associated and scapegoated. I'm going to look dumb and not know. What if I'm going to be abandoned? I'm going to lose the protection of the bully. I'm going to have to face. You see, the more I faced my parents' cruelty, the more I faced my own cruelty. Because I did what my parents did to me to my younger siblings. So it's a double whammy. As I'm learning, they weren't loving me. They were sociopathic assholes, asking their 6-year-old to do what they couldn't deal with doing at age 30. Really? It's too much for me at age 30? I'll have my 6-year-old do it? You fucking coward. Well, those are our parents. So, the teachers at Waldorf School couldn't deal with an 8-year-old's trauma and grief. So we'll throw them out of school so that we don't have to become emotionally illiterate or examine what we're doing wrong. Maybe dissociation is what has to happen for an ego to survive when the grown-ups around them are that fucked up. So could we deal with why are so many of our parents fucked up? Well, that's not going to go very well at the school parent meeting. I looked at the psychological report, which labeled all of my symptoms and turned the symptoms into psychological labels. Well, my parents didn't pay a psychologist to tell them how they were fucked up as parents. Now, having done the trauma literature, I can read through that report and say that children who behave in this way and exhibit these symptoms have been treated this way by the grown-ups and culture around them, because these are the symptoms of those diseases. Just like a gardener can look at a wilting rose plant and say, you could hire a gardener to do a report on the rose. What's wrong with this rose? Well, this rose is wilting. It's showing signs of definite wilting. This rose is showing signs of yellow leaves. It's got yellow leaf disorder. Oh, thank you very much. Here's your $500. Well, why is the rose wilting? What about adding a little water? You see, the gardener is left out of the equation. The parent is left out of the equation. It doesn't say there is a diagnosis of ignorance on the part of the parent, that they cannot even water their own plants, and then know so little about psychology that they don't understand that if you don't water the plant, it wilts. But they thought it was a good idea to plant plants without studying the art of growing plants. Well, you'd say that's pathologically insane. But the parent isn't going to pay the $500 bill to hear the long list of how they are crazy. But they will pay the $500 bill to have Latin names describing the symptoms of their abuse on their child. Well, if narcissists are paying the bills of the psychologist, if the psychologist wants to make a lot of money and betray their patients, they know exactly how to write the reports. The most innocent part of this entire dynamic is the internal little girl and little boy of the child, therapeutic patient, community member, citizen, that is at the effect of the ignorance, the fear, the reptilian behavior, the addiction, the trauma, the chauvinism, the collusion, the siding with the bigger one. Because if you take this position with me, I can guarantee you, you will never be the majority. The most intelligent faction in any group is a distinct minority. You have to be incredibly secure, and you have to care a lot before you're willing to step out of the gang and stand with the minority that is on the side of science and data. Because if the majority has a way of doing it, they will kill off the reputation, the money, and sometimes the body of the person that is challenging the status quo, because they've got all these votes that they've internalized from the culture. And there's just 20-30% in them that says, I hate to see this happen, but I'm not going to lift a finger. I'm not going to become a possible target. I'm not going to expend any energy. I'm not going to learn anything. I'm not going to pass the bill in my House of Representatives that is good for the people. I'm going to let my fear, my bully, my shame run over me. And this is a democracy. The majority in every one of us will win the vote to interrupt abuse cycles or to enable and allow them. That requires a vote. Requires someone to put forth a bill. You do nothing, the energy momentum continues, the abuse continues. Just leave it to the next generation. If they haven't destroyed the planet operating and externalizing these abuse protocols in the next 30 years, then they can give it to the next generation, and they can apply all that self-hate and incompetence on their environment as well, and we're bound to kill the planet off in another couple of decades if we can just keep giving it to the next group. I don't want to get in the way of have all these angry high people at me. Let's just give it to the next sexual abuse victim and get on with my life.